Hello everyone. Today we're going to continue our lecture on computer music. So we're really going to look in the 70s and 80s with the development of real-time systems. So last class, most of the systems and the programs that we looked at were using large mainframe computers. They weren't real-time. Most of them didn't actually synthesize sound. And so today we're going to kind of look at more recent developments and the creation of more real-time systems. So first we're actually going to talk about a composer who used a system that was not real-time, one of the older systems, but then we'll get there. So first we're going to talk about a composer named Charles Dodge and one of his pieces called Earth's Magnetic Field. So a little bit of the backstory. Charles Dodge was a graduate student at the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And while he was there, by this point, the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio had acquired a computer, and they were using Max Matthews's Music 4BF to program that computer and to program and synthesize digital sound. But kind of like how the music programming languages were used at Bell Labs, this was not real time. So someone had to write their computer program on one computer, store it and render it on another, and then run that through a digital to analog converter, which would then convert into the digital signals into sound. So it was kind of a cumbersome, long process. So that's kind of the context in which Charles Dodge created this piece. So that's Dodge's background. And at the same time, there were three NASA geophysicists working at the Goddard Institute, which is a NASA institute based at Columbia University. And they were studying the impact of the sun's radiation on Earth's magnetic field. And so they basically were just measuring this over the span of over a year. And they collected a ton of data, all numeric data, and they decided that it would be fun if they mapped that data or translated that data into musical notation so that they could kind of, in a way, listen to what this data sounded like. And this is one of the first examples that we have sort of in the 20th century of what we now call data sonification, which is basically the mapping of scientific data to sound. And so basically what they did is they created this chart down here called Bartel's musical diagram, in which they translated certain numeric data to musical pitch. And so each musical note was sort of the compressed 3 hours of data. So that meant that there were 8 notes of music per day, so that in total they ended up coming up with 2,000 notes basically in order, and you can kind of see them here. And what they did was when they made this musical mapping, they mapped the scientific data based on certain number ranges to 2 different musical scales. One was to a 7-note diatonic scale, which is basically like a normal musical scale, and the other was a 12-note chromatic scale. So that's basically like all 12 notes on the piano. And so they mapped, again, kind of this data to these musical scales and then to this kind of chart, which is just basically all the notes one after the other. So that they had pitch information, but that was just kind of, if you were to listen to it, it would just kind of sound like one note after another. It wouldn't necessarily sound super musical. So these researchers approached Charles Dodge to basically create a piece with this Bartel's musical diagram. So since the pitch material was already determined based on the data that these scientists collected and then mapped to the diagram, Charles Dodge's main job was to come up with the rhythm and the timbre for the data. And so that was kind of his big task. And what he says is that he really wanted to try to capture a sense of the sun's radiance. And you can see here there's the record of it. That's definitely kind of emulated here in the record cover. And so Charles Dodge broke down the piece into 2 different sections. The first used only that diatonic, the 7-note scale. It was monophonic, which meant that it was just kind of one note at a time. accelerated in tempo, so there wasn't so much rhythm as there was just like over time it kind of sped up and slowed down. And then for the timbre, he used something called a comb filter, and that's basically a filter that filters out frequencies at regular intervals, so it kind of looks like a comb. And that created this kind of real, kind of vibrant, radiant sound. And then in the second part, it was both, he used both the diatonic and the chromatic scale. It was polyphonic, which meant that there was more than one note at a time. It used two alternating rhythmic patterns, and that was it for part two. And what you can kind of hear, I think one of the coolest things is you get a sense of kind of like when there's a lot of activity or not. So you can tell what there's like when there's density of notes that there's kind of like a solar flare or something like that. So this is your required listening for this section, so make sure that you go listen to Charles Dodge's Earth's Magnetic Field when you get the chance. And one last thing to mention is, like I said, he was using this mainframe computer, so even though students at Columbia Princeton had a computer at their disposal, they didn't have a digital to analog converter, so they had to go all the way up to Bell Labs to actually hear their piece. So not only did it take a lot of time, they actually had to travel like a matter of, I don't know, 30 miles or so into New Jersey to actually hear their piece. So a really cumbersome process. So now we're going to get into several real-time digital compositional systems. So the first that we're going to talk about is a system called the Groove system. And this was developed by Max Matthews and Richard Moore at Bell Labs. So we're back at Bell Labs. And Groove stands for Generated Real-Time Output Operations on Voltage Control Equipment. So the title kind of gives away what it does. It's basically a computer that generates protocols for voltage control, which then controls voltage control or analog synthesizer equipment. So this was sort of a hybrid analog digital synthesizer, or digital system, analog digital system. So basically, like I said, it's a computer that was used to generate synthesizer protocols. So you get both the benefit of being able to use a computer to come up with algorithms and generative musical processes with the really great timbral qualities, the really great sound synthesis possibilities of an analog synthesizer. So again, the computer could be used to kind of create, to generate control parameters, but that would then generate voltage control that would control the synthesizer. And there were several ways in which this could be used. So a lot of the people that used the Groove system kind of used the computer to control the synthesizer, but some composers also used the computer to store things that they were doing on the synthesizer. So some did kind of the other way around. So this was real time. It was interactive. When someone changed their program, they could then run it right away and hear it on the synthesizer equipment right away. And it was much more interactive than earlier systems, where if they changed a knob on the synthesizer or changed a protocol on their program, they could hear the results more or less in real time. And a little bit about it is that it had 14 control lines. So that's basically it could control 14 different parameters or aspects of the sound or aspects of the composition. It was also hooked up to a magnetic tape machine, so the sonic output was always recorded. The last thing to note about the Groove system is that it wasn't commercially available. There was only one Groove system, and it was located at Bell Labs, so this wasn't something that most people ever had access to. So now we're going to talk about one of the composers that did have access to the Groove system, and that's Laurie Spiegel. And she's today probably the most commonly associated composer with the Groove system. And she worked at Bell Labs from 1973 to 1979. And she also used a later Vampire system, which was used to generate visuals as well as audio. So Laurie Spiegel has a really interesting and kind of varied musical background. She studied composition, performance, and music history at Juilliard, and she was a very skilled plectrum player. And plectrum are basically just different kinds of guitar instruments. So she played classical guitar, banjo, electric guitar, she played lute, basically anything that was guitar-like, she could play it, and she could play it really well. So she not only studied composition and performance, but she also studied ethnomusicology, which is basically the study of how basically like people around the world make music. And she was particularly interested in the music that was made in Southern Appalachia. So basically banjo picking and different kinds of shape note singing and folk music. And so that she went to and spent a great deal of time in Southern Appalachia studying how they made music and studying kind of the culture around folk music there. So by the time that she came to Bell Labs, she was really interested in seeing if she could come up with generative computer programs that could program and generate basically folk music that could have the kind of vibrancy, rhythmic complexity, and modal kind of elements of folk music. And so I think what we see here with Laurie Spiegel, there's a couple notable things. I think the biggest is with a lot of composers that came before her, if we think about like Lejarn Hiller and Leonard Isaacson with the Iliac, they wanted to make classical music with their computers. And here we have Laurie Spiegel, who's really interested in making music that's really more accessible, music that's more of the people, and using computers to do that. And this really shows something that we'll kind of talk about throughout the rest of this lecture, which is that the backgrounds that people bring into using a computer really have a big influence on how they're using their computer. So basically, a computer is not objective. A computer does what a person, a human, programs it to do. And so a lot of the time, I think that this is like part of the more common cultural discussion around computers today. But basically, composers and computer engineers bring their own musical, aesthetic, ethical, cultural biases and backgrounds to these systems, and they use these systems in ways that reflect them more so than it necessarily reflects the system itself, or it's some kind of combination between the two. And Laurie Spiegel was really kind of explicitly anti-elite. She wrote essays about wanting to make computer music that was accessible to anyone, and she also wanted it to be expressive. So in some ways, she's also kind of like Wendy Carlos, who wanted to make, she didn't want her music to be too abstract or kind of atonal so that anyone that was listening to it could really get a lot out of it. And she wasn't just interested in making sort of real-time generative music. She was also interested in real-time improvisation with the computer, which I think also kind of comes from her study of folk music and plectrum, is that a big part of folk music is just people getting together and improvising together. And she wanted to be able to use computers and program computers so that she could improvise with them. So, oh, and also I included an interview with Laurie Spiegel in the lecture, and I'll include it after, so go back and make sure that you watch it because she talks about the groove system in her time at Bell Labs. So you're listening for this section is a piece by Laurie Spiegel called Appalachian Grove 1. Trust me, at some point I'll probably say Groove 1, but that is a good way to remember what she was using. So for Appalachian Grove, Laurie Spiegel used the groove system. And in this, this is an example of one of those pieces where she tried to use the computer, use the groove system to emulate and generate folk music, or music that emulated Southern banjo picking and shape note singing. And one thing that she was trying to capture is a sense of the modal stereophonic hockets that happen in this folk music or in banjo picking. And modal basically just refers to these kind of like non-Western, sort of like piano-based scales that we often hear in folk music. Stereophonic means using the stereo field of basically two different speakers. So when you listen to this on headphones, you'll hear that there's different signals being sent to the different headphones. And hockets is a word that we get from medieval music, which means basically hiccup, and it's where basically you'll hear like da 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 da, and that the idea there is that it's kind of like it creates these kind of pockets, and you'll hear one pocket in one ear, and then another pocket in another ear, and one pocket in here, and one hiccup here. So it kind of creates this sense of like space, or even like a hiccup in the sonic field. And this piece was generated and synthesized using the groove system. And I'll also include some videos of Southern banjo picking and shape note singing so that you can get a sense of kind of how much Laurie Spiegel's piece really picks up elements of this banjo picking. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of lecture 13. Up next, we'll talk about Carlo Scaletti and the Kima system and George Lewis's Voyager system. So now we're going to talk about Carlo Scaletti and the Kima system. So Carlo Scaletti is a composer, a harpist, and a computer scientist. And a little bit about her background is that she studied at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, at the Experimental Music Studio. And she was there from the kind of the mid-70s until the mid-80s. She did her undergrad, her master's, and her DMA there, which is a doctorate of musical arts, and then she went back and got a computer science degree there. So she was very much like a U of I person. So a little bit about her musical background there. When she was studying there as a graduate student, she was trained in both the use of analog synthesizers, and she was able to use a computer with Music 4BF. So it's interesting that even by like the late 70s, people were still using Music 4BF in universities. And what she really loved about using analog synthesizers was the ability to kind of shape really unique sounds, unique timbres, unique tones, and to be able to change them in real time. But she felt like it was really lacking in creating kind of unique hierarchical musical systems. So it was really hard to kind of layer sounds. You had to use a tape machine to layer sounds and to create hierarchy, which kind of brought you out of real time. And the thing that she really loved about using computers was the ability to kind of create really complex harmonic and musical structures. She was really interested in how algorithms worked, and she's also throughout her career been very interested in kind of how biological and physical processes happen. So a lot of her more recent work includes physical modeling, and then like corresponding aspects of modeling, say, a virus to sound, so kind of elements of data sonification. And those all require a certain amount of hierarchy, and she felt like, you know, she could do that with a computer, but again, using these mainframe computers, it was very much not real time. You had to use the computer, and then you had to wait, and you had to use the digital to analog converter, and it just took a lot of time, and it wasn't interactive. It was very much out of time. And she felt like the system that she wanted to create, the music that she wanted to make, really didn't exist. And in the following quote, she talks about kind of the kinds of universal patterns that she was interested in creating. And so I think reading this quote might give us an indication of like how kind of analog synthesizers and computers at the time were kind of fell short of what she needed. So she said, when I was 16 or so, at that age when you were sort of trying to figure out what's my purpose, I couldn't sleep one night and I was looking out my window and trying to figure out what my mission was. That's when I thought, there are these patterns, and some people are scientists, and they are figuring out the patterns by doing research and science. And I'm a musician, but maybe I could make these patterns audible in a way, a contribution, that I could recognize these patterns and make them understandable. So really, she wanted to sort of look at biological or physical phenomena and translate them into sound to make these kind of universal patterns more audible to people. And again, she felt like using an analog synthesizer or using computers at the time really fell short. So she really wanted a digital synthesis system, a computer system that could generate sound in real time and that could be used to kind of interactively program music and program sound. And so she came up with her own system, the Kima system. And this is it is a software and dedicated hardware system. And just to be clear, in the 1980s, if someone wanted to generate sound using a computer, it by nature necessitated a separate piece of equipment, a digital to analog converter, some kind of other sound processor, because computers at the time, and really today, computers are still not quite powerful enough to just generate all the samples needed to generate sound. So really a separate system is still required. People still use sound cards, they still use plugins and other things to kind of generate the sound on their computer. So even though now it seems kind of clunky to have a dedicated hardware, in some ways this was kind of like the most efficient way, since this hardware is explicitly designed to work with the software that they created. And she created this in collaboration with her partner, Kurt Hebel, who is an electrical engineer. And the thing that's unique about the Kima system, there's a couple things. One is that it uses an object-oriented programming paradigm. And this is a programming paradigm that was developed in the 1980s. And one thing that's interesting about this, and today programming languages, most of them have elements of object orientation now. Most aren't just like one kind of paradigm. But basically in an object-oriented programming language, you get objects and they are programmed to do a certain behavior, and they send and receive messages to other objects. So it's a very modular approach to programming. And you basically, each thing has its own function, and you connect it to other things, and you can create these real hierarchical systems very easily. And so it really lends itself to the creation of music and compositional systems. Another thing is that it has a graphical interface, which at the time was very unique. Today there are other graphical music programming languages like MaxMSP, and most kind of have some kind of graphical interface, but this was, again, really unique at the time. So you're not just writing lines of code. It's not a scripting language. You have these objects and you open them up, and then within the objects you have lots of parameters, and you can write lines of code in the parameters, but a lot of the coding that you're doing is just kind of combining objects together. So it's not a straightforward just like scripting language. And by doing that, you kind of get the best of both worlds. There's an aspect of kind of patching like you would get in an analog synthesizer by combining these objects, but then you are also doing some coding once you open these objects up, and you can do some coding in their parameter boxes. And one thing that's also really cool about the Kima system is each sound object, when you click on it, will automatically play and automatically make a sound. And you can hear the changes that you're making in real time, and you can make changes to the program as you're listening. So this is like one of the first really interactive musical systems that we got in the 1980s. So your required listening for this section is a piece by Scaletti called Sun Surge Automata. And something that's important to note is that it didn't actually use the full Kima system. It just used the dedicated hardware. And it was programmed using, I believe it was just like machine language and C language subroutines. So that you don't need to know that. Just that it was made using the platypus dedicated hardware. And there's since been, other versions of the dedicated hardware. Right now they have the Pacarana, and before they had the Capybara. So you might notice a theme there with the names. So this piece, Sun Surge Automata, is based on a one-dimensional cellular automata. And a cellular automata is just kind of like a mathematical kind of formulation. The most famous is Conway's Game of Life, which sort of models population growth or decay, and it's based on really 4 simple rules. And by just using these 4 simple rules, you can kind of generate all these really interesting behaviors by just going from many states to state to state. Basically the rules, I'll just read it to you. So with the cellular automata, it's based on just like kind of like a graph of these cells, and whether or not a cell is considered kind of alive or dead or full or empty is based on these rules and the behavior of the cells around it. So the rules are: any live cell with fewer than 2 live neighbors dies, as if caused by underpopulation. Any live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors lives on the next generation, onto the next generation. Any live cell with more than 3 live neighbors dies, as if by overpopulation. Any dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes a live cell, as if by reproduction. So it's just these 4 simple rules, and by just using these rules, you can create all these really interesting patterns by going from state to state to state to state. And this cellular automata was used to govern 3 different processes. The first was to organize clicks into rhythm. The second was to open or close gates on a recording of Scaletti's voice. And the fourth is to drive a car plus strong algorithm. And a car plus strong algorithm is basically just a model of a plucked string. So you'll hear throughout the piece there's kind of this plucked string that goes, and by the end there's kind of this burst of this car plus strong algorithm. And so this quote that Scaletti is reading for the second one, where the gates are opening and closing on a sample of her voice, is a quote by Lewis Thomas, who was kind of a popular scientist at the time, who talked about kind of how life developed thermodynamically, and how that kind of mimicked the creative process. And so Scaletti was really interested in this idea that creativity, human creativity, kind of emulates the original creation or the original development of life. So this is your required listening for this section. Make sure that you go back and listen to this piece. And I included the full Lewis Thomas quote here if you're interested in reading it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about George Lewis, who, like Scaletti, was a composer and computer scientist. He also was a performer. He played trombone, and he's also a musicologist. So he does a lot of different and kind of interrelated activities. So a little bit about his background is that he early on went to Yale and to study music and philosophy. And he really enjoyed philosophy, but I think it was after his second year of school, he got kind of burnt out and decided to take a break. And he moved to Chicago to work with this group called the AACM, or the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. And the AACM was a Black-run organization in Chicago that basically kind of housed a number of ensembles and educational initiatives to basically, like the name says, support the development of creative work in the Black community explicitly in Chicago, but then also kind of more broadly. And it was really based on principles kind of taken from free jazz, in which they wanted to support individualism and creativity in the context of a wider community. So to facilitate the growth of kind of mutual support and community, but also really encourage people to develop their own musical voice and their own sound. And so after spending this time with the AACM, George Lewis was kind of refreshed and given kind of new musical inspiration, but also given the inspiration to kind of drop his music major. He was kind of like, I'm not learning anything from those people in the music department, but I can see how I can develop my own kind of philosophy or use philosophical histories to kind of come up with new ideas. And so that's what he did. And since then, he's been a professor of composition and musicology. He also worked for a number of years in New York City as the music director at The Kitchen, which was kind of like an experimental music and performance venue. And then he also worked at IRCAM in France, which was a computer music research center. So a real varied career. He's still a professor at Columbia University. And what we're really going to focus on today is talking about a system that he developed in the 1980s called the Voyager system. And I'm going to go back to this slide really quick because it was really created based on this impetus after working with the AACM and kind of really becoming kind of deeply involved with free jazz and this performance collective, realizing that and also his time at IRCAM, sort of realizing, as we've kind of talked about, a lot of the computer music systems that were being created kind of at the time, but also that had been created before that, were really based on kind of European classical musical systems. So we saw that with the Iliac. We even kind of saw that with Laurie Spiegel, although I'd say Laurie Spiegel's was both based on more of like a hybrid musical system, but by and large, computer systems were created by white men and used European musical systems. And so George Lewis kind of came up with this framework called Afrological versus Eurological musical systems, or improvisation. And he wanted to, with the Voyager, create a digital interactive music system that supported and reflected more of an Afrological improvisational framework. And he was partly inspired by the work of a painter named Jeff Donaldson, and we can see one of his pieces here. And Jeff Donaldson came up with a framework that he called multi-dominance, which is basically where you get multiple streams at the same time. And this is also really reflected in free jazz and in the sort of kind of goal of the AACM, or this idea of individualism supported in the context of a community. And that's very much what free jazz is about. It's about supporting each musician's individual voice within the context of the whole. So George Lewis wanted his Voyager system to be a system in which a live performer could in real time interactively improvise with a computer. And so this was like a totally different framework than most of the systems that we'd seen before this. And this is a super sophisticated system. It analyzed over 30 different musical parameters. And then one thing that's also interesting about this is that the Voyager system basically takes in the input by the live performer, it analyzes these 30 parameters, and then it's programmed to kind of respond to the musician. And it's not designed to mimic the musician. The computer is also designed to have kind of its own individualistic response. So it's like another stream in the multi-dominant framework. So again, this was a real kind of different framework and showed a real kind of difference of musical values than other systems that we'd seen up to this point. And I've also included here an interview by George Lewis where he kind of talks about his musical development as a whole and talks a little bit about his time at the AACM and developing the Voyager. And one thing that I think is really great about this interview is that it also includes videos of people performing with his Voyager system. And what's cool is he performs with his Voyager system, but he also brings in other composers and musicians to perform with it. So you can find lots of videos and things of people performing with the Voyager online. So that's it for Lecture 13. I'd love to hear from you all in the discussion section if you have anything you want to discuss that this lecture made you think about or that you have questions about. All right, take care. Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the use of electronics in performance art and pop art. So first, let's talk a little bit about what I mean when I say performance art. So performance art is sort of a nebulous category for different kinds of art. And the most important element of performance art is that it's time-based and that it also involves human performers. So as you can imagine, time-based, there's a lot of time-based arts like music, theater, and other kinds of performance. Performance art sort of builds on those kinds of more traditional art forms, and in some ways just tries to critique those art forms. Performance art is inherently interdisciplinary, so you'll often see combinations of music, dance, theater, sometimes also visual art. It's also very conceptual and very critical. So again, performance art often sort of critiques traditional forms of music or traditional forms of theater or traditional forms of dance. And I think performance art today is something that like we're all sort of familiar with. Like there's elements of performance art in a lot of the more mainstream art that we experience. I think examples of this is that like there's a lot of pop musicians that have taken on elements of performance art. So like Solange is a good example of this, Lady Gaga, FKA Twigs. These are all artists that kind of incorporated elements of more experimental performance art into their regular practice. And so hopefully as we talk more about specific examples of performance art, this will become more clear. And also just a little bit of the history of performance art, really based on a lot of the earlier work by Marcel Duchamp, who in addition to creating the conceptual works of the ready-mades, like the fountain, the urinal that he put in the art gallery, or the bicycle wheel that he also put in the gallery, he also was known for doing sort of like drag performances. He had an alter ego, and he would dress up in drag and do sort of like performances and take pictures and do things like that in this other persona. Cage's work is also sort of a precursor to performance art. I think especially with a piece that he did called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So usually if we were in a normal class, I would just do a performance of this for you, but I can't, so I will include a video of someone else performing it. And the basics of this piece is basically just, it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, but it's performed by a human performer. So the first performance was done by David Tudor using a piano, and it starts, he just sits at the piano, opens up the piano bench, puts his hands on the keys, and sits there for a certain length of time, and then closes the piano lid, and then opens it for the second movement, and he does this for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And this is sort of like, again, it's very conceptual. He's not actually playing music. The idea is that the sounds that make up the piece are the sounds that kind of happen incidentally in the performance space while the performance is happening. And this was kind of Cage's idea that there's no such thing as silence. And again, this is time-based. So it's sort of like putting a frame around a given amount of time and just kind of experiencing the sounds that happen there. And again, there is this like elements of performance. There's a human performer kind of helping the audience put the frame around this time period. And so even though the focus is on the incidental sounds, having the human performer there really focuses the listener's attention in a way similar to the kind of attention someone would pay in a more traditional musical performance. So that piece was from 1952. So that was well before kind of the 1960s and 70s where performance art really emerges as a practice. But Cage's work, like that piece, and like other pieces that we've talked about, like Variations 5 and other pieces where he starts to amplify things and just, you know, his pieces just started to include reading text, or sitting and performing everyday actions with a contact microphone. So all these things are sort of precursors to performance art. Other artists that we talked about that kind of verge on a performance art are artists like Pauline Oliveros with her sort of live improvisations. Carolee Schneemann's work is also early performance art, things like Meat Joy, where she was, and then Interior Scroll. And also the work of the Sonic Arts Union is sort of, again, kind of blurring these boundaries between traditional musical performances and traditional theater performances and kind of creating something new. So like these new kind of performance experiences. And today we're going to talk, all those artists didn't, well, with the exception of Schneemann, their work wasn't necessarily considered strictly kind of performance art. It was kind of always presented in the context of music. And so today we're going to be looking at artists whose work really kind of blurs these boundaries even further. So to start, we're going to talk about a composer and performance artist from New Zealand who was also based in London, and then she spent most of her career in New York. She was a professor at Hunter College in New York for most of her career. So her name is Nea Lockwood, and she became really interested as a young composer in the possibilities of recording sounds. And she was really interested in kind of recording sounds that weren't necessarily possible to record before, or like sounds that you wouldn't necessarily think of as musical sounds. So one of her earliest pieces is called The Glass Concert, in which she amplifies different pieces of glass in a space. And then another kind of piece in that series involves her recording the sounds of breaking glass and breaking lots of different thicknesses of glass and types of glass, and recording those sounds and then constructing a piece out of those recorded sounds. And the pieces that we're going to talk about today are a series called The Piano Transplants. And the first piece was kind of inspired, the impetus of the piece was that she really wanted to get a really good recording of fire. And she kept trying to record lots of different types of fire, in a fireplace, a bonfire, and she didn't have a very satisfactory experience. And at the time, she learned about this thing called the piano graveyard, which is basically just like a dump where people would put their old pianos and kind of put them out to pasture, and when they were no longer usable, when they were, as she says, beyond repair. And so that's kind of where she got this idea that maybe what she could do is kind of burn a piano and record the sounds of a piano burning. And this does a few things for her, and it also kind of relates to her work that she does later on. She becomes really interested in sort of the unfolding of natural processes and the ways in which, as a composer, she could make audio recordings of natural processes. And she also is very interested in the idea that like listening is a creative act. As a listener, and I think Cage's work and some of these other works that we're going to talk about really are kind of similar in this vein, that the listener isn't just someone that's passive, that's just receiving something that a composer does, or just receiving the sounds that a performer makes. They're an active participant in the work. And that's definitely the case kind of with a lot of performance art, that the listener or the audience member becomes a very active participant. So let's talk a little bit about this piece, Piano Birding. So she created scores for each of these pieces, and they're all instructions. So this is something that anyone could do. And again, the score is really simple. It's just instructions. So she says, first, please note all pianos used should be already beyond repair. So I think there's sort of like a sustainability thing there where she's sort of like, don't use a like functioning piano to do this. Don't be wasteful about this. Use something that's already beyond repair that's not going to be used for anything else. So she says, set upright piano, not a grand, in an open space with the lid closed. Spill a little lighter fluid on a twist of paper and place inside near the pedals. Light it. Balloons may be stapled to the piano. Play whatever pleases you for as long as you can. So this is the score, and whenever she's performed this piece, she always records the sound of the piano burning. So she always places a microphone inside the bottom of the piano. And so a couple interesting things happen there. One, it gets a great recording of fire. And two, is that at a certain point, the microphone kind of succumbs to the same natural process, fire, as the piano. So the recording really only lasts as long as the microphone can kind of hold out until it eventually melts and kind of fizzles out. So there's kind of like an interesting element in which the recording is subject to the same process as, and the sort of technology is subject to the same process as the piano. And just hopefully you'll see that these pieces kind of do several things. So one, it enables her to explore natural processes. And as we talk quickly about the other two pieces, you'll see what that means. They enabled her to record natural processes. And then there's also this kind of critique of the kind of cultural and political place or cultural and political associations with the piano. You know, we've talked about a lot in this class, and I've kind of alluded to the fact that like the piano is kind of like the embodiment of Western classical music. It's this system that was put in place that really kind of disciplined or created a discipline of Western tonal classical music that was all based on this really rigid system of these 12 notes, these certain set amount of keys, and it really imposed a lot of structure and a lot of, again, kind of discipline on how people made music in the West for a really long time. And again, when we start with Schoenberg, we see that like he's really a composer that starts to poke at how arbitrary that system is. And then through the 20th century, we see composers go further and further outside of that system. But this is kind of another way in which she could kind of critique and kind of poke at the importance of the piano in Western cultural practice. So let me read there's two more pieces that she's made. One is called Piano Garden, and here's the score. She says, dig a sloping trench and slip an upright piano in sideways so that it is half interred. A small grand piano may be set down amongst the bushes, etc. Plant fast-growing trees and creepers around the pianos. Do not protect against weather and leave the pianos there forever. So you can see there's also kind of like a conceptual element there that it's about what does it mean to be forever, and what would happen to this piano if it's there forever, and so that we can't experience forever, so that sends us in a conceptual mind space to imagine what happens to this piano if it's there forever with these fast-growing trees and creepers around it. And then she also has a piece called Piano Drowning, and that's one of the other pictures that you saw on that slide, the first slide, and she says, find a shallow pond with clay or other hard bed in an isolated place, set upright piano into position vertically just offshore. anchored the piano against storms, etc., by rope to strong stakes, take photographs, and play it monthly as it slowly sinks. So again, it's this idea that like she's not just subjecting these pianos to natural processes, she's also finding ways to document that. So here she explicitly talks about taking photos and playing it. So again, this is also kind of conceptual because that immediately makes me think of like, oh, you start to imagine it slowly sink and what it might be like to play this piano as it slowly sinks. And I think we also get a lot out of these pieces by just reading the scores conceptually without having to even make them ourselves. And then her most recent version of this piece is called Southern Exposure, and it says, chain a ship's anchor to the back leg of a grand piano. Set the piano at the high tide mark, lid raised. Leave it there until it vanishes. So I've included links to these scores on our required reading so that you can take a look at these yourself, and NA Lockwood includes pictures and links to videos that you can check out. And I also included a link to a more recent performance of this piece. It was done just a couple years ago, and it's really great. This is going to be your required listening for this section, and it includes a short interview with NA Lockwood, which is really great to kind of hear kind of how she conceptualizes the piece. And then you'll also get to kind of see a modern day version of piano burning. Okay, that's it for part 1 of lecture 14. Up next, we'll talk about the Fluxus movement and the further development of performance art in the 60s. Okay, so now we're going to go to New York City. And in the 1960s and 70s, this was a real hotbed of creative activity. And you could really say that performance art kind of emerged out of this context in the 1960s and 70s, where basically people making lots of different kinds of art were all interacting with each other and kind of being influenced by the ways in which other people were making art. And so some of these different genres that we think of now include performance art, minimalism, and that's minimalism in music and in visual art, sound art, rock, video and multimedia art, pop art, happenings, hip hop, techno, and punk. So all of these things kind of emerged out of New York City, some of them in the 70s, but some of them as early as the 1960s. And this kind of exchange really kind of created this kind of burst of different new art forms in the 1960s and 70s. So first, we're going to talk about the Fluxus movement. And Fluxus is another one of those things that's really difficult to kind of coherently and concisely define, because today we sort of think about it as like a coherent collective of artists that were sort of developing different kinds of performance and experimental art, but it really wasn't. At the time, it was very much just like a loose affiliation of artists from different mediums. It included poets, musicians, video artists, and visual artists. It was sort of spearheaded by this guy, George McCunis, who in particular was interested in creating these pieces of art that just kind of consisted, as you can see here in this image, of different objects that would just kind of be like given away. It was kind of these collections of art objects of kind of playing cards and little just like doodads and knickknacks that you can see here. And this was kind of how he thought of making art. But Fluxus eventually sort of became an umbrella term for a certain kind of conceptual and performance art. And you can see here in this picture, they're sawing away at a piano. And so I think that, again, it's sort of like we've already been talking about, these artists all took sort of critical stances towards their given medium, whether it was visual art or poetry or theater. It didn't really matter what it was. And some of the artists involved include McCunis, Brecht, Alison Knowles, Alan Capro, Yoko Ono, Inglis McLeese, Jackson McLough, Nam June Paik, Dick Higgins, Carolee Schneemann, I say Capro twice, and then Ben Patterson. And all of these artists, again, it was kind of this like loose affiliation. And something that's kind of interesting, a connection to this class, and I think which sort of gives a real musical perspective to what they were doing, is this loose affiliation really started in one of John Cage's classes at the New School in New York. And this class was called Experimental Composition. And so right from the start, Cage really provided an educational framework in which composition meant any kind of art form. And he was just interested in encouraging experimentation no matter what kind of background someone had. And I think, like I said before, it's like with pieces like 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or these pieces where Cage was just putting kind of contact microphones on things, he really kind of, there was a lot of freedom for students, and I think he set a lot of precedent for the ways in which the Fluxus artists kind of thought about performance art. So a couple other things that kind of defined Fluxus is they were kind of anti-art establishment, so they were anti sort of materiality. With the exception of these art objects, one of the things that was really attractive about performance art is that it was kind of ephemeral. It sort of happened in the moment. It wasn't something that could be included in a museum or a gallery. So even though it could be performed in a museum or a gallery, it's not something that a gallery could necessarily own easily. So there was sort of like an anti-capitalist, anti-art establishment sort of bent there. Sort of following Cage and Duchamp and other experimental artists, there was kind of this like breakdown between art and life. So a lot of the Fluxus artists were really kind of interested in incorporating everyday objects, incorporating everyday actions into this kind of performance environment. And like I mentioned, they also kind of wanted to include sort of a breakdown between who's the performer, who's the artist, and who is in the audience, or who is the viewer. And they really sort of tried to break down that hierarchy. And hopefully as we talk about some of these pieces, it will become clear. So a really good example of one of these Fluxus pieces by a musician is a piece by Ben Patterson called A Penny for Your Thoughts. And I'll include a video of a more recent performance of of this piece at the end of this lecture. So the idea behind this piece, A Penny for Your Thoughts, is that Ben Patterson sets up a little booth and he pays people that walk up to it a penny to give them their old thoughts. And the idea is like, it's sort of this exchange of ideas between an artist and a participant. And he also what he does is sometimes rather than giving the audience a penny for their thoughts, he constructs them these hats out of newspapers. And of course, newspapers are filled with lots of ideas. So wearing a hat with a newspaper with someone else's ideas on it is kind of like this idea of wearing or trying on someone else's ideas. And so again, that's this idea of kind of an exchange. And it's also sort of a critique of like the elements in which ideas kind of function in a capitalist society, in which ideas become a mechanism of commerce. And so this is Ben Patterson here, and I'll include a link to this piece, but I think this piece is kind of emblematic of a lot of the performance art that came out of Fluxus. This idea of like kind of setting up a booth, anyone could come to it. It uses objects that anyone could get a hold on, newspaper, a stapler, some paper and pens. And it's really this kind of conceptual, sort of whimsical exchange that someone could discard their old thoughts they don't need anymore. It's this kind of cleansing act on the part of an audience member. And it's also this like potentially meaningful exchange, but also potentially meaningless exchange. That just kind of heightens a moment, an interaction between two people, between an artist and a viewer. And again, it sort of levels the playing field between the artist and the participant. So hopefully that'll become more clear when you watch the video. So next, I want to talk about a collaboration between two Fluxus artists. And I guess something to sort of mention before we get on to this is one of the really complicating factors with Fluxus is that in some ways it was a really inclusive group. Because it wasn't a formalized collective, it was just kind of a loose affiliation. People kind of came in and out of association. But it was largely kind of spearheaded by this guy, George McCunis, who was a really problematic figure. And he sort of soured the waters between the relationships of people involved. And he was really sexist, super kind of misogynist, and really dogmatic about what he thought should be included as being Fluxus. And he was kind of well known for like blacklisting people from calling their work Fluxus. So, and that especially impacted the women involved. So some of the artists that he blacklisted, including Charlotte Moorman, who we're going to talk about next, including Yoko Ono, and including Carolee Schneemann. So that was kind of the dark side of Fluxus and George McCunis in particular. But that kind of dogmatism didn't necessarily characterize other people involved. So even though he was sort of dogmatic, in some ways it didn't actually muddy the waters too much between a lot of the performers and the way that they interacted with each other. So I've included this short like documentary here called The Topless Cellist, which is about Charlotte Moorman. So that'll give you a little glimpse into sort of what she does. So a little bit of the background here is that Namjoon Paik, who we've already talked about when we talked about Cage's Variations 5, is a multimedia visual artist who was born in Korea but spent most of his life in the United States, in New York City. And he is known for making a lot of video art, but also at this time he started to make sculptures out of televisions. So one of my favorites is sort of like a robot made out of televisions that I believe is housed in the San Francisco Museum of Contemporary Art, if you ever get a chance to go see it. And something that's kind of interesting about Namjoon Paik is that he was also trained as a pianist, like a really serious virtuoso pianist trained in Germany. And I think that in some ways, a lot of the performance artists that we're going to talk about were trained as musicians. And I think there's something about performing as a musician and the discipline involved in being a musician that sort of gave these artists a certain perspective about what it meant to be a performance, or what it meant to undertake a performance, and different ways in which they could kind of stretch that medium. And Charlotte Moorman was trained as a classical cellist. And she also was really important in this kind of movement because for many years she ran what was called the New York City Avant-Garde Festival, which was an important outlet for a lot of the artists that we've talked about in class or that we will talk about to perform their work. And so she was really kind of important in funding and supporting a lot of experimental work that happened in the United States and in New York City for a long time. And something that's also interesting about Mormon is that she was roommates with Yoko Ono and Carolee Schneemann. So there was a lot of kind of mutual support among these performance artists that we're going to talk about. So something that's important to say up front about Mormon and Nam June Paik is that they were both really provocateurs. They were sort of bombastic personalities, really big personalities that were sort of like really caustic and sort of divisive. For a good example of this is Nam June Paik. I think it might have been the first time he ever met John Cage, came up to John Cage and cut his tie in half. So that's really a way to introduce yourself. And of course, Cage, who as experimental and open-minded as he was, didn't take too kindly to his tie being cut in half. But I think in a lot of ways, for Nam June Paik in particular, he really sort of took this like lack of separation between art and life very seriously. And in some ways, his whole life kind of became one long performance. So there really was no boundary or separation between his artwork and his everyday life. So a little bit of the background of how they started work together starts actually with a piece that Nam June Paik created in 1963 called the Exposition for Music Electronic Televisions. So this is where he starts to make these sculptures out of televisions in which he included these special magnets in TV, and he played Chopin on a piano, and depending on what he played on the piano, it changed the images on the televisions. So that sort of got this started, and he became interested in seeing how he could work with other musicians to sort of like create novel TV instruments. And he found the perfect collaborator in Charlotte Mormon because she was very open-minded. And one of the first pieces that they created together is a piece called TV Bra for Living Sculpture, and you'll see images of this in the previous video, which is basically just two small televisions fashioned into a bra that she would wear while she played the cello. And depending on what she played on the cello, it would trigger the images on the bra to change. So you can imagine in the 1960s, this was very provocative, and they were both really interested in kind of just like really confronting these taboos around the body and around sexuality at this time, and also around classical music. And the next piece that they worked on together is a piece called TV Cello, and you can see a video of her performing this here, and it's the same kind of idea, except instead Nam June Paik created a cello out of these televisions, and they had strings over it, and so depending on how Mormon played the strings, it would change the images on the television. And she would often play this topless. And so this eventually got her arrested, and she became known as the topless cellist, and she was really unapologetic about it. She kind of refused to make any kind of concessions or walk back what she did in any way. She was very just like kind of open about, this is just like, this is my body and I can perform my cello however I want. And this, I think, really confronts a lot of taboos, again, about kind of the human body, the female body in particular. And it also kind of pokes at the conventions of art, classical music, and classical art. If you think about classical music and the cello and the piano, so the cello is often played in an orchestra, and if you've ever seen a video of an orchestra play, you might notice that a lot of the times all the performers are wearing black, all black. The women tend to be in kind of like covered up completely in long sleeve black tops, long skirts, and black tights. And the men often wear tuxes, so people are completely buttoned up. And the idea is like the focus is on the music, not on what the people are wearing. And if you see a solo cello performance, women are often wearing ball gowns. They're sort of elegantly dressed, often very covered up. And it really sort of, in some ways, objectifies and sort of anonymizes the performer. And Charlotte Mormon, I think with this work, really sort of critiques that and critiques the sort of conventions of classical music. So make sure that you watch these videos of Charlotte Mormon performing the TV cello, and in this documentary above, performing with the TV bra. You can actually see it in these pictures here. So next we're going to talk about another Fluxus artist, Yoko Ono. So a lot of you probably know Yoko Ono as John Lennon's wife, but she was a lot more than that, and she really had her own performance practice before she met John Lennon, and kind of while they were together, and kind of separate from that. So she really had a lot of her own things going on. And something that's kind of the context for this whole movement that we're talking about is that she was not only important as a performer and as a creator, she was also important as kind of a community builder. She had a large loft in New York City, and I mentioned before that Carolee Schneemann and Charlotte Mormon lived there at various times. And this became a really important kind of central meeting place for experimental artists in New York City. And it was also a performance space. She housed performances there regularly. So on a given weekend, you could pop by the loft and see what was going on there, see who was hanging out there and what pieces were happening. And it was kind of informal and a really important kind of early platform and early kind of test space, workshop space for people to kind of test out these ideas. So Yoko Ono's own work is very much conceptual and performative. And she says about her own music that I think of my music more as a practice than as a music. The only sound that exists to me is the sound of the mind. My works are to induce music in the mind in people. So like really by definition, conceptual music. Even though her pieces often include actual sound and include performance, it's that kind of mind expansion and imaginative space that she's really interested in exploring. So one of her early pieces is called Voice Piece for Soprano, and this is the score here. It's very simple. And if we were in class together, we'd all perform it together, but if you want, you can perform it alone by yourself in your room, or you can just watch Yoko Ono performing it at the MoMA. And again, the piece is really simple. It just says, scream, against the wind, against the wall, against the sky. So you can see, very conceptual. You can actually do this, but it really is much more than just screaming, which is actually extremely cathartic. It's really about imagining, what does it mean to scream against the wind or against a wall or against the sky? Like, sure, I can kind of point in different directions, but like, what does that actually mean? So again, it's really more of a conceptual exercise. And one of her most famous pieces is this piece called Cut Piece, in which she got on stage fully dressed and had audience members come up one after the other and make a cut in her clothing. And you can find videos of this on YouTube. And again, I think one thing that this piece really does is that it not only pokes at kind of taboos and kind of around the female body and around nakedness in kind of contemporary society, but it also, I think, really breaks down that audience performer boundary where the audience members come up and they become a part of the performance. And so it really kind of gives people this experience of what it means to be a performer. And again, kind of puts a frame around a given time. So the piece that we're going to talk about, the reason why we're talking about Yoko Ono in this context is not just that she's a good example of a performance artist, but that she also kind of sometimes thought about technology, and technology was often an implicit part of her practice. And a good example is this piece called Tape Piece 3, Snow Piece. And it says, take a tape of the sound of snow falling. This should be done in evening. Do not listen to the tape. Cut it and use it as strings to tie gifts with. Make a gift wrapper if you wish. Use the same process with a phono sheet. So it's this idea of first making a tape recording of the sound of snow falling, which is impossible. If you tried to record snow falling, you could not actually hear it. So by that very nature, it brings the reader into an imaginative space. And then it's this idea, you're not even supposed to listen to the tape. Cut it and use it as strings to tie gifts with. So by thinking of it as something that's part of a gift, you're also then conceptually thinking about, what gift would I get? Who would it be for? So it immediately makes you kind of think of like someone else, and it puts you in this new relationship in this kind of conceptual space. So I think this is a really kind of an interesting way to think about technology in the context of this course, that it in some ways can also be thought of really conceptually. Okay, so that's it for part 2 of lecture 3. Up next, we'll talk about pop art. Okay, so lastly today we're going to talk about pop art. And for those of you that are familiar with visual pop art, the kind of best example is someone like Andy Warhol, who kind of incorporated images from popular culture and made screen prints of them. His screen prints often included kind of many repetitions of the same image, or many repetitions of the same image with slightly different colors or things slightly changed. So that's in some ways also a really good example of minimalism, because minimalism often consists of very simple elements that are repeated. And that's true of minimalism, whether it's in visual art or whether it's in music. And so kind of the sonic analog that we're going to talk about to kind of visual pop art is the band The Velvet Underground. And part of the reason is that they sort of embody a lot of this like cross-fertilization that was happening in New York at the time. But they're also, again, kind of the sonic soundtrack to a lot of Andy Warhol's films and kind of what he was doing. And so I think that it kind of fits into some of what we're talking about. So again, pop art and pop art rock, which the Velvet Underground is sometimes called as well, kind of came out of this cross-fertilization between like the Fluxus scene, the Warhol scene. It was kind of considered proto-punk, so a lot of the sort of elements of it ended up contributing to what would later be considered punk music. But then there's also this cross-fertilization between the experimental music that we've been talking about and minimalist music. So one of the biggest influences to the music that is related to this class is the music of a composer named Lamont Young. And Lamont Young is an experimental composer who's really interested. He was very influenced by Indian Carnatic music, and he is interested in creating kind of long drones. And at this time in his career, he was creating music under the name Theater of Eternal Music. And so this is the idea that he wanted to create long drones that could go on forever. And today, if you've heard of Lamont Young, you might know of his piece called The Dream House, which he created in collaboration with his wife, Marianne Zazalia. And it's basically just a room with pink lights designed by Zazalia, and then an oscillator that creates this very specific frequency or set of frequencies that just like goes on forever, or kind of indefinitely. So it's just basically like for hours and hours and hours. It's all day long. And so that kind of gives you like insight into sort of his world. But he was very interested in kind of using amplified instruments in order to create these long drones. And some of the instrumentation included little synthesizers, oscillators, harmonium putting pickups on harmoniums, but also using amplified string instruments like the viola and the violin. And the real crossover here is that the violist in the Velvet Underground, John Cale, also played in Lamont Young's Theater of Eternal Music. And Angus MacLeese also sometimes, who played drums in the Velvet Underground, also sometimes played with Lamont Young's Theater of Eternal Music. And so this element of a drone, of an amplified viola drone, really crosses over into the music of the Velvet Underground. And so I don't think I have a slide for it, but you're listening for this piece, or for this section, is a piece by the Velvet Underground called Heroine. And you'll hear throughout the piece this viola drone, this amplified viola drone by John Cale, that kind of grounds the music. So if you've heard the song before, it's really simple sonically. It's just really kind of bare bones instrumentation that kind of repeats just a couple chords over and over again. And something that kind of characterizes the music is that it speeds up over time throughout and slows down. So when you start to build up towards the chorus, it speeds up and then it slows down. But you hear this drone kind of the whole time, and it really drowns the piece. So make sure that when you listen to this piece, that you can identify the drone. And if you can't, please come in to student hours or office hours this week, and I'll make sure that we can talk about it and identify it together. Okay, so that's it for the Velvet Underground. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Laurie Anderson, who also kind of emerged out of this New York scene. Kind of she wasn't quite Fluxus, she was a little later than that, but just very much involved in kind of this like minimalism music, and this cross-fertilization. So we didn't talk about it when we talked about tape music, but one of her early inventions was this thing called the tape bow violin, in which she put a tape deck on a violin, so kind of like an audio, a pickup, that could pick up the sound, and she put a strip of magnetic tape on a violin bow, and then she would string the violin bow with the magnetic tape across the violin, and it would basically make it so that the violin could read the tape or play back the tape. And so that was kind of an early way for her to make tape loops and to kind of manipulate a strip of tape using her violin. So it really became a performance tool for her. But she was also interested in performance art. She was trained as a visual artist and went to art school. So even though she was trained as a violinist as well, she also was interested in art. And one of her earliest pieces of performance art is this piece called Duets on Ice, in which she froze a pair of ice skates into ice blocks. And she stood on a street corner wearing these ice skates in an ice blocks and played her violin until the ice melted. So again, I think that focus on kind of time and natural processes or an unfolding process over time is kind of key to understanding performance art. So by the late 1970s, she kind of moved away from that kind of performance art into creating songs. And these songs were often multimedia. They weren't just about creating music and lyrics. They often incorporated theatrical elements. And in these songs, even though she was interested in incorporating theatrical elements and video, she was also very interested in narrative. And in particular, she wanted to incorporate colloquial language. So what do I mean by colloquial language? She wanted to include the kind of everyday phrases that we say in our daily lives. So for instance, one of her pieces, New York Social Life, is basically just conversations between New York artists on the telephone. So she was really interested in these like telephone conversations. And so you'll hear her in some of these pieces say, "Hello, how are you? What's going on, man? How you doing? Oh, just taking it easy." So like kind of using everyday phrases that people kind of take for granted all the time. And this kind of does two things. It sort of both kind of, I think what it does really is it sort of takes the focus away from everyday language, and so that you're just kind of thinking about like the musical form or the sounds that are unveiling. You don't even have to necessarily think about the language that's being used. Or if you do, it kind of again is another example, almost like Duchamp's Ready-Mades. By incorporating everyday language instead of an everyday object into a song, you kind of break down these hierarchical boundaries between what we consider art and between what we consider kind of like our everyday life. And that again kind of makes you think about art differently, but it also makes you think about life differently. So a lot of these pieces are kind of considered minimalism because they musically are very simple. They include simple elements that repeat. And a lot of her pieces also include electronics. So both electronic instruments, but she also uses a lot of vocal processing. And she uses it for various reasons, but one of the reasons why she's really interested in vocal processing is that she says it allows her to do a kind of vocal drag in which she can take on various personas vocally by just using vocal processing. So again, kind of embodying different characters becomes really important for her in her work. So the piece that is your required listening for this section is a piece called "Oh Superman" from 1981. And again, this is kind of creating songs that tell a story using colloquial language. And so it's not necessarily a story that makes sense, but you'll hear when you listen to it that there's this element of kind of a story. And one thing that this piece did is that it really popularized the use of a vocal harmonizer. Even though she was kind of an experimental artist, this became a #1 hit in the UK, and it became pretty popular in the United States as well. So the the harmonizer on her voice, what's also kind of sometimes called a vocoder, was really kind of an identifying element of this piece. And again, it became so popular that, car commercials started using this, within a year after it came out, and other artists started to use the harmonizer as well. So the music itself is, again, I mentioned that it's really similar. The main accompaniment is just Laurie Anderson's voice singing two tones over and over again. She just goes, and that's it. That's the whole accompaniment. And so you can see here that she's not just using electronics to kind of create effects sonically, she's also using multi-tracking. So by recording that background and then singing over it, that's an example of multi-tracking. So using multiple tracks of tape. And then the other thing that we'll hear is a Farfisa electronic organ. In addition to this really simple accompaniment and Laurie Anderson's voice, she also includes this organ riff that kind of also characterizes the piece. So that's it for kind of the music. And then it's also, this piece came out the first year that MTV was ever created, or the year that MTV was created. So there's also an associated music video that kind of becomes an integral element of the piece. So when you listen to this, I want you to watch the video instead of just listening to it on your own, and to kind of go along with the video. And I think that kind of, again, kind of indicates the kind of experimental approach to performance art that she had. Okay. So that's it for the meat of lecture 14, but I also included this here, which is a video by W Magazine from a few years ago in which Kendall Jenner and Gigi Hadid recreate several pieces of performance art. And it's really just sort of a ridiculous video. It's hard to tell whether or not they're actually taking it seriously. And I think that this is just a really good example of how things that were once really cutting edge and really revolutionary, that totally critiqued the mainstream culture, end up kind of becoming appropriated and kind of incorporated into mainstream culture, and also kind of incorporated into like capitalist structures that become something that was maybe anti-capitalist, like Yoko Ono's cut piece. Like, she's literally cutting the clothes off her back, showing kind of like sort of poking at kind of materiality and kind of commerce and commodification of clothing and things like that, then becomes appropriated by a fashion magazine 40 years later to then sell clothing. So this is, I think, a good way in which things that are at one time kind of culturally revolutionary are often reappropriated into mass culture as to sort of like sell commodities later on. So that's just kind of an extra for you. And I'll include this on Canvas as well. Okay, if you have any questions or want to talk about any of these pieces, please join in on the discussion section or join the student hours or office hours later on.